He kōna I purangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
They say life is stranger than fiction.
And these alpha particles are actually what Rutherford used when he did his famous experiments that kind of started to unravel atomic structure. So Rutherford used these alpha particles to fire at a gold foil.
But sometimes what we see in movies or read in books is so incredible that it obviously couldn't be possible. Or could it?
So we can actually, by understanding these radiations and trying to use them in clever ways, we can use these sorts of radiations to actually remove cancers.
Welcome to Sci Fi, Sci Fact. I'm Brian Crump, and this is a podcast where we take science fiction's strangest ideas, weirdest elements, most unfeasible plot drivers, and explore if they could actually happen in real life. Maybe they already have. And in every episode, we bring in a scientist from New Zealand's McDiarmid Institute to explain the theories behind some of fiction's more fantastic flights of fancy, if any theory exists. Kryptonite. In this episode, Professor Bill Williams, McDiarmid Institute Principal Investigator and Professor in Biophysics and Soft Matter at Massey University, gives us his take on Superman's kryptonite, the green crystalline material that emits radiation and weakens Superman's superpowers.
I'll mold this box into your prison bars. Don't touch that.
I told you. It's kryptonite, Superman. A little souvenir from the old hometown. I've spared no expense to make you feel right at home.
First off, Krypton. Now, Superman on the planet Krypton was just another regular guy, wasn't he?
I believe that's true. Yeah, I believe he only got his superpowers coming to Earth or presumably other planets.
That's right. I mean, he comes to Earth and he can fly. He's faster than the speeding bullet, and he can stop a train in its tracks. But back on Krypton, whatever they had, he was just like everybody else, right?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that the kryptonite effect was just something which essentially could be used on planet Earth to take away his powers, or in fact to harm him.
Well, that's the thing. He comes across a hunk of the old planet here on Earth. And what happens? Well, I mean, we hear you couldn't actually hear Superman saying much. Maybe you could hear underneath. He sounds a bit uncomfortable. But what is it about the old planet that gets him in trouble?
Well, it's not too clear really in the stories, because it's not exactly clear how his powers are acquired. But what is for certain is that when he's in the proximity to this material, the material is harming him. And so it seems like the material's radiating something which is having a bad effect on his physiology and not just taking away his powers. Although I think in some of the comics there was a type of kryptonite that just took away his powers and didn't harm him. But the most common one that you hear about is the green kryptonite, which does actually, as you say, leads to him crying out for help, basically.
But generally harmless to us humans.
Yeah, it would seem so. So obviously, it seems as if the material's emitting some sort of radiation which is only harmful to him. So we do know about materials that radiate. I could talk a little bit about that, but we're not. And certainly different organisms could be susceptible to those radiations to different degrees. So on planet Earth, I guess the radiation which we might be most familiar with is what's called electromagnetic radiation. Electromagnetic waves not only include radio waves, but a whole spectrum, which includes visible light, which we are able to use to make images with and use a lot as humans, right through to things like X-rays, gamma rays, ultraviolet, infrared. All these things are essentially different flavors of the same thing, which is electromagnetic waves. In fact, it's something which is fascinating that you can think about. It's not just used in technology, but also essentially all material that has a temperature will be radiating. So you yourself are a source of electromagnetic waves. And if you think that's weird, you can kind of think about these night vision goggles. You know, you can see people in infrared, right? And that's because they're emitting infrared radiation. So when it comes to electromagnetic radiation, not much of that is dangerous to organisms on planet Earth, except for very high energy electromagnetic radiation. So X-rays and gamma rays, for example, carry enough energy that they are a type of what's called ionizing radiation.
Bill,
so
can
radiation,
a couple of questions before we get onto that, because
sure.
I'm sorry, you piqued my interest here. Now, when infrared radiation is actually still part of the same spectrum that includes light and radio waves, and that is in the form of heat that it comes from our bodies. So, you know, as you say, you use infrared goggles and you can see the heat coming from a body, if that body is emitting heat, if it's alive, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, actually, it turns out it doesn't really have anything to do with being alive. It has to do with the fact that because matter is made up out of small particles like atoms, and because those atoms generally are made out of charged particles, and because at the microscopic level the whole world's doing a beautiful little dance, that means that all materials are essentially full of charged particles that are moving on a microscopic level. And it turns out that moving charged particles is exactly how you generate electromagnetic waves. Matter consists of charged particles that are jiggling around, and that means that electromagnetic waves are emitted. And really all that matters in terms of what sort of electromagnetic radiation is emitted is how much jiggling there is. So the sort of and that relates, of course, to the temperature of the object. So a hotter object, if you take the sun, for example, something like 6,000 Kelvin around the photosphere, because it's 6,000 Kelvin, it actually emits light, which is in what we call visible. And if you look at yourself, you can use the same physics to say, well, I'm not 6,000 Kelvin, or whatever temperature that is in centigrade. I'm whatever 37 centigrade.
Or thereabouts.
And because of that, I emit infrared. And so in fact, all you need is the temperature of the matter, and you can work out what electromagnetic waves are being emitted.
And some of that infrared, as it's emitted, it will interact with the air and will heat the air a bit. But the radiation that you see with infrared goggles is the radiation that is traveling at the speed of light. But the heat from our bodies that heats the air, well, that's not moving at the speed of light. It will heat the air around it, and maybe that warm air will come towards another body. But what we're seeing with infrared goggles is actually the electromagnetic radiation, not the heat itself. Do you understand what I'm trying to say here?
That's true, but it's the heat that generates the movement that generates the electromagnetic radiation. But the electromagnetic radiation itself always moves at the speed of light, yeah. At least in a vacuum, it moves at the speed of light.
Why is it that some of the things on the spectrum of electromagnetic radiation, such as X-rays and gamma rays, I mean, light and that infrared heat, that doesn't really harm us, doesn't cause any trouble. Radio waves don't seem to harm us that much. But X-rays and gamma rays do. Why?
Yeah, well, it turns out that those different radiations we talked about have intrinsically different energies related to their wavelengths. So typically, X-rays and gamma rays, which have a very short wavelength, they tend to carry more energy with them, the higher frequency. And also, processes that generate them often actually generate high intensities of them. So those short wavelength radiations, X-rays and gamma rays, just tend to take more, they have more energy associated with them. And because of that, they can actually interact with matter in different ways. And even, as I said, strip electrons out from atoms. And that's sort of a dangerous process. But it's not only, when we talk about ionizing radiation, there's not just the electromagnetic radiation sort. We also have ionizing radiation from radioactive elements. So again, probably most people have heard of things that are radioactive and probably pretty reluctant to go near them, so to speak.
Uranium or plutonium.
Exactly. All these kind of things. And they so these radioactive materials have nuclei in the center of their atoms which are unstable and can actually decay. And when they decay, they emit high energy particles. And those particles are generally either what's called alpha particles. They're actually like the nuclei of a helium atom. And actually, a good Kiwi connection, these alpha particles are actually what Rutherford used when he did his famous experiments that kind of started to unravel atomic structure. So Rutherford used these alpha particles to fire at a gold foil, and then he looked how they were deflected. So some materials actually, as well as emitting this electromagnetic radiation, which can travel through space, they can also emit particles, which are either these helium nuclei, or you can also have electrons, which are formed essentially from processes going on in the nucleus, which is called beta particles. So this alpha radiation and beta radiation, that's another form of ionizing radiation, but which is particles rather than the electromagnetic waves. And on this planet, those are the things that we tend to think of as being very dangerous and associated with radioactive elements. But it's important to realize that there is natural radioactivity all over the place.
Why is it, though, that some radiation, what does it do to our bodies that can make us sick?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think, largely speaking, there's kind of two ways in which radiation can be damaging for us. So one is it can literally directly damage the tissue, so just kill cells, basically, by dumping a lot of energy in them. The other thing it can do is cause problems to our DNA. And so this is, again, people probably heard about the associations of radiation with cancer. So you can have these kind of two kinds of different damage you can do. I don't know if you've seen, or any of the listeners have seen, there's been a really cool program recently called Chernobyl, which is kind of it's kind of a little mini series that was based on what happened at Chernobyl. And you see on that there's some horrible scenes where when the reactor catches fire at the beginning and the firemen turn up and don't know what's going on, you can see, within a day their tissue is basically dying, and they die quite horrible deaths. So from very high fluxes of high intensity radiation, you can get quite quick cell death, or you can get these perhaps slightly less intense radiations that damage our DNA. And this sort of thing tends to come out, in later life when our cells replicate. If our DNA has been damaged, then we end up maybe getting cancers and things like that. So do we know,
Bill, why some radiation damages DNA, affects DNA in particular?
I'm not sure it affects DNA in particular. I just think that's kind of the part of the cell which, if because it's so important in cell replication, and our cells are replicating all the time, it's the sort of bit that kind of, if you like, it's perhaps the most sensitive part. So if the DNA is damaged, it's going to cause damage. It's not perhaps that DNA is attracting all this radiation. It's just it's most likely to leave lasting damage in the DNA, like break the chains, basically. So it's a kind of induces chemistry to happen where the DNA chains can, for example, either break, so literally snap, or induce mutations where then our cells find it difficult to deal with that.
Now, the most likely scenario in terms of a real-life equivalent to kryptonite, at least in terms of what it does to Superman, a.k.a. Clark Kent, is that it's some kind of radioactive material. If it's too close to him, it would be like having plutonium too close to us. If I had a hunk of plutonium in on the desk in front of me, I wouldn't be feeling too good in a hurry, would I?
That's true, although I feel like it's maybe worth 1 minute to kind of give the other side and say that, of course, as science has progressed and we've started to understand radiation more, even ionizing radiation from radioactive materials, we've been able to harness that. So, cancer ultimately is as far as I understand it, it's a disease of rapidly growing cells. And in fact, you can use radiation treatment, right? So if you know people who've had to go into radiotherapy, for example. So we can actually, by understanding these radiations and trying to use them in clever ways, recently there's been big advances in being able to target radiation in that way. We can use these sorts of radiations to actually remove cancers. And I should say it's actually still, as far as I understand, it's still a little bit of an open question as to low doses of radiation, how dangerous they actually are. So definitely high doses of ionizing radiation are definitely not good for us. Doses of this ionizing radiation that we can harness and focus, we can perhaps use for medicine. But also it is possible that small doses of radiation are not actually that bad for us. There was a study many years ago looking at the rates of cancer in the US, where there's hugely different local geology. And so in different states, there's all sorts of different background radiation rates. And what that study found is that people who grew up in states with a slightly higher background radiation rate actually suffered less cancers in later life.
Oh, really?
So there was a kind of hypothesis that, within our bodies, we do have mechanisms for DNA repair. And there was a kind of hypothesis that low doses of radiation allowed those systems, a little bit like an immunization, allowed those systems to develop. So I think the jury on very low doses is actually still out. So
however, the one thing, Bill, that I want to explore right now is, so kryptonite makes Superman sick, but it doesn't make humans sick.
Yes.
Are there radioactive substances or are there animals or creatures which say we might get sick from radiation from plutonium, but they won't?
Yeah, there certainly are.
So the cockroach, would the cockroach be to us what we are to Superman with kryptonite?
I think that's not a bad analogy, yeah. So honestly, I don't know that much about cockroaches, but I know just because I think it's a cool organism. I don't know if you've ever heard of tardigrades.
No.
They're sometimes called water bears. So you can maybe Google water bears and you'll see these amazing little things called tardigrades. They're all around the tiny microscopic creatures, but they are like the superheroes of planet Earth. So it's known that these guys can basically withstand 1,000 times more radiation than we can. People have tried to do all sorts of horrible things to them, and they can withstand an amazing amount of things. So tardigrades would be my example. Certainly they can stand a lot of radiation. I don't know the biology of why they're able to do that, but it's demonstrable that they can. There was also a cool bacteria you might have seen in the news maybe a year ago. There was a bacteria which people in the International Space Station basically kind of put outside the space station in a little container for a year. And there's a lot of radiation out in space, which normally on planet Earth we're shielded from by the atmosphere. So the kind of out in space, you'd expect things to acquire a lot of radiation damage. But this bacteria was, alive and kicking after a year outside in space. So I think there certainly are organisms, and as I said, I don't know much about the biological mechanisms by which they're able to survive, but it's certainly fascinating.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Sci Fi, Sci Fact, hosted by me, Brian Crump, produced by Andrew Robertson, and of course, made possible thanks to the incredible knowledge of those brilliant scientists at the MacDiarmid Institute. You can find more episodes of Sci Fi, Sci Fact on the RNZ podcast page. RNZ podcasts are also available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or pretty much wherever you might find your podcasts. And make sure to follow us so you don't miss out on any new episodes.